Hi there, welcome to the Bowery Boys. This is Greg Young.
And this is Tom Myers. And today we're visiting one of the most famous neighborhoods in New York City, Brooklyn Heights. It is a New York historian's dream neighborhood, located just south of the Brooklyn Bridge and overlooking the East River.
It's a dream neighborhood because it really does offer a crash course in, among other things, architectural history. Because when you walk the streets of Brooklyn Heights, it's like you're walking through time. You can experience much of what the neighborhood was like 100 years ago or even 150 years ago, because so many of the buildings that are standing in that neighborhood today were the very first buildings that were constructed on those lots in the mid-19th century.
And it's no accident that these buildings still exist today. They are still around because of the hard-fought preservation battles that were waged by local community groups that helped protect them and culminated in the creation of the Brooklyn Heights Historic District in 1965. But today's show isn't just about the neighborhood's architecture.
It's also about the fact that Brooklyn Heights went from farmland high upon a ridge after the American Revolution to become the city's first suburb just 4 decades later.
And not just the city's first suburb, but America's first suburb. So we'll be talking about how that happened, and even more generally, what suburban living was even like in the early 1800s.
So prepare to hear the names Pierpont, Hicks, and Lafayette, and Lady Montague.
Okay, Greg, to get started here, obviously we need to situate the neighborhood of Brooklyn Heights. Take us there, quite literally. Explain what the borders are.
Well, where it is exactly on a map is very key to its existence. It is a neighborhood on a plateau, on a heights, overlooking the opening of the East River into New York Harbor and, of course, across the water from Lower Manhattan. Now, it is a largely residential neighborhood, mostly homes and apartment buildings that were built before the 1930s, with a few exceptions. And many of those buildings even date as far back as the 1820s. Mm-hmm. Now, what's unique about this neighborhood is it's the first official New York Historic District, and unique in that the historic district is almost coterminous with the actual neighborhood boundaries.
That is to say that the entire neighborhood is almost within this historic district.
Almost.
So what didn't make the cut?
Well, let me explain. So Brooklyn Heights stretches from slightly south of the entrance of the Brooklyn Bridge on the north side. The west is essentially the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, or Furman Street, which is the local access road beneath the BQE.
And is today next to Brooklyn Bridge Park in the East River.
Yes. The southern border is very easy. It is Atlantic Avenue. And the eastern border to Brooklyn Heights is Court Street, which then becomes Cadman Plaza. Now, because this stretch, Court Street and Cadman Plaza, is the most commercial, the most built up, there are kind of a lot of different architectural things happening here. So some of that is not in the Brooklyn Heights Historic District, but everything else that we'll be talking about is.
But Court Street and Cadman Plaza are not the only commercial stretch in Brooklyn Heights.
No, there's this little zone on Henry Street, which has some cool restaurants and bars. Mm-hmm. But you may be thinking about Montague Street, which is sort of the main street of Brooklyn Heights.
But haven't you kind of skipped over here, perhaps the best known part of Brooklyn Heights?
Yeah, the most famous part of Brooklyn Heights for many people on the western side, hovering over the BQE, perhaps a little precariously, is the Promenade, which is a platformed esplanade, which presents this entire gorgeous view of the harbor and Lower Manhattan to the public. Okay, so that's what's very interesting is it's a public space, although then right next to it are all of these private homes that are behind a large fence.
But this esplanade wouldn't be added to the neighborhood until the 20th century.
Right. And then, of course, there's Brooklyn Bridge Park, which is right along the edge of the water, which wouldn't even come along until the 21st century.
Right.
So I want us, Tom, to imagine what all of this looked like many centuries before that, 400 years ago. What could this possibly have looked like?
So rewinding to the early 1600s.
Yes. I want us to start by imagining New Jersey. Imagining the Palisades, a bluff that's very high above the water, right? Now, here in Brooklyn, it wasn't quite as steep on this particular spot. There was actually a very high elevation, a cliff, with a steep slope all the way down to the waterfront. Just think of it as a very high outcropping, or Ipatonga, or high sandy bank. That was the name that the native Canarsie people gave to this region.
And I'm assuming then that the native people were using this as kind of a lookout point, this high perch.
It would have been ideal to look for any ships approaching in the harbor, say in September of 1609, when they might have seen Henry Hudson sailing into the harbor. Not to mention the arrival of the Dutch, who made their first permanent settlement in 1624.
So then it would be the Dutch who would be creating these first European settlements here on this side of the East River as well, on Long Island.
Yes, Long Island.
Long Island, which sounds funny to us today, but this is Long Island. Everything here from Brooklyn Heights out to Montague.
The Hamptons, yeah. I mean, Brooklyn Heights is on Long Island, and there ain't nothing you can do about it. Well, in 1657, the Dutch settled their first towns here on this western end of Long Island, including one down at the very foot of this bluff that I just described.
Okay.
Situated around a very modest ferry landing. The name of the town is, of course, Breukelen, named for a place in the Netherlands. Then, just 7 years later, in 1664, the English sailed into the harbor and then promptly took over all of those Dutch land holdings. They would continue to rule the area, of course, until the late 18th century.
And so then the English would anglicize the name to Brooklyn.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a proper English word, Brooklyn. There was even a village in England named Brookland. And many old maps of Brooklyn actually spell it out like Brookland. Now, during this English period, several large mansions, large estates began cropping up on this high elevation here, and it soon took on the name Clover Hill.
Clover Hill. Isn't that like an organic grocery brand? I think I have some like Clover Hill.
So is Clover Hill like organic yogurt or something?
But I'm assuming it's because there was actual clover here, like there were fields, vegetation.
Beautiful plant life everywhere. Yes, it was a very lucky place for its first residents, Tom. Many of these first estates along here, the owners trace back to Dutch ancestry, and many of these first European landowners, their names will appear throughout the neighborhood to this day. Names like Remsen and Middaugh and Furman.
But these families are building country estates up here on this ledge or overlooking the harbor.
Yeah, it's like the most ideal property of Brooklyn because you're able to look out and you have a huge estate, right? They're all kind of right next to each other. Now, two particular homes that I want to talk about here. The first is that of Philip Livingston, who built a 40-acre estate here on property that was actually originally owned by the Remsens. It was a beautiful mansion house with adjoining orchard that was built in 1765. So he owned the land all the way down to the water, so even down toward the slope. And at the waterfront, at around today's Girolamo Street, built the very first gin distillery and beer brewery to produce here in the borough. Isn't that amazing?
Right there on the river.
Yes. Of all the beer that is now produced in Brooklyn, it starts right here at the foot of Girolamo Street.
The original craft brewery. But this Livingston, is he the same Livingston? I mean, Livingston's a big New York City family name. Mm-hmm. Is he the same Livingston that signed the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah, believe it or not, one and the same. He lived here in Brooklyn Heights. He actually ended up fleeing his home during the war and escaped upstate, where he died in 1778. But then this point brings me to the second house that I want to talk about that was right next door and is related to the subject of the Revolutionary War. Now, just north on the area of today's Montague Street and Hicks, sat a second house, which belonged to the Cornell family, and which would become known in urban legend as the House of Four Chimneys, and remembered for its supposed involvement in the Revolutionary War. Today, if you go to the promenade, you'll see a flagpole and a plaque dedicated to this house.
Which they call Four Chimneys. They must have had a lot of rooms to heat.
A lot of hearths.
Had a lot of hearth. But what do you mean by supposedly?
Well, there's an urban legend surrounding the House of the Four Chimneys that deserves a little inspection here. So, the Battle of Brooklyn, August 1776, we've talked about it in other podcasts. Essentially, the English invade Long Island from Gravesend and essentially run Washington and his Continental Army to the very tip here of Long Island. They've been almost destroyed by the British troops. Now, in the run-up to the war, the American patriots had built forts in the areas in anticipation of the British arriving. And naturally, this high perch here was well suited for one such fort named Fort Sterling. And that's today on Clark Street and Columbia Heights. You can also find a plaque to Fort Sterling there. But down here on Montague Street is where you find the second plaque for the House of the Four Chimneys. It was here, according to urban legend, that Washington met with 7 generals and decided that it was more important to save the remainder of the Continental Army instead of continuing to fight them and what would have most certainly have been a devastating defeat.
Right, and so he retreated to Manhattan and onward from there. But supposedly, why supposedly?
Because sources claim that this famous meeting, which by tradition took place in the Cornell House, most likely actually took place at the Livingston House next door, and that would have perhaps even made more sense, given Livingston's own connection to the American cause.
Like Livingston had just left the back door open on his way out of town?
Well, yeah, I mean, he probably just said, like, help yourself to whatever's in the fridge, you know? And so because of that meeting, Washington evacuated his men by every watery conveyance available on the waterfront, and the entire army left from the shores of Fulton Landing. Think about this, Tom. Think of how important this one moment is, because had they not escaped, we might not have actually had a revolution after that.
We might be delivering this podcast with British accents.
Which would be incredibly annoying, I would imagine. But that's how important Brooklyn Heights is as a revolutionary site. And I think people forget that very easily because there's so much more that happens in the history of this neighborhood. Now, post-war and into the new nation of the United States, the village of Brooklyn, still down here, you know, at the foot of this little cliff, reverts back to its sylvan pastoral ways for a little while. And before I pass it back up to you, Tom, I want to read something from the New York Post in 1802. And it's the real estate listing for Philip Livingston's house, which ran in the Post in 1802. Quote, "The country seat of the late Philip Livingston, Esquire, deceased, on Brooklyn Heights in Kings County, containing about 13 acres. The mansion house is large and convenient. The property and situation are too well known to require a further description." So this is sort of a harbinger of what is about to happen in this marvelous neighborhood.
And when was that ad placed in the Post?
1802.
Which brings us back into this amazing little period, this period right after the war, but before the opening of the Erie Canal. But it's this period of like optimism and promise and proving that the American experiment would succeed. And all of that was happening in New York, but it would also happen here in Brooklyn.
Well, one thing we know is Livingston House is for sale here. What else is on the market up here?
There are other beautiful homes up here. There's the Middaw Mansion in today's northern section of the Heights, around today's Henry and Poplar Streets. That mansion had actually been inherited by the Hicks brothers, John and Jacob Hicks, who I just like referring to as the Hicks brothers because they sound kind of like a boy band. So the Hicks are they have a bunch of property in the north part of Brooklyn Heights, but south of there, as you mentioned, the Livingston family had that large swath of land, which was bordered kind of by today's Joralemon Street to the north and State Street to the south.
Joralemon is an interesting name. Was there a Joralemon family that moved in?
Oh, yeah. Old man Toinus Joralemon. Old Toinus, he was a grocer, he was a farmer, and he bought part of the Livingston farm and actually raised produce here, which he put up for sale in the markets of New York. And there was a lane that separated his farm from his neighbors to the north. That was the Remsen family. That lane would end up being called Joralemon Lane in 1805, which is today's Joralemon Street. And he'd walk down that steep slope, like you mentioned, to take a boat over to southern Manhattan.
But it just sounds to me like it's just very few families, just a handful of people that really live up here around this place. When did people start moving in here, like in greater numbers?
Well, there's one more family I want to point out we need to meet. That would be the family of Mr. Hezekiah Pierpont. Hezekiah was born in 1768 into a prominent New England family. So prominent, Greg, he was related to James Pierpont, who was one of the founders of Yale University. He moved to New York. Hezekiah moved to New York in 1790, and he would build a fortune in importing and exporting and kind of like having wild adventures on the high seas. He would lose his money and get it back. But he also married well. He married Anna Marie Constable of the Constables of New York.
Daughter of William Constable.
That is correct, who had all kinds of money and gave Hezekiah 500,000 acres of land in upstate New York. As a kind of wedding present.
But he didn't live there. He didn't live in upstate New York. He moved here, right, to Brooklyn.
Yes, he wanted to build an estate right here. So in around 1803, he bought up 60 acres of land from various estates around here.
Now, 60 acres would be a pretty large plot of land here in Brooklyn Heights today. So was he just going to develop it for his own pleasure?
Well, he wanted to build himself a nice estate, of course, looking out over the bluffs like his neighbors. But then, yes, he would also divide. He was a businessman. He wanted to, he saw how he could divide it up and sell it off at some point. But he dreamed of developing something more upscale, something very refined around here. But he knew that this would only be possible if there was a reliable ferry service between this area and Lower Manhattan, where the city was situated.
And to underscore, this is the only way to get from New York to Brooklyn is by water.
And to underscore further, a lot of underscoring, that also ferry service wasn't that reliable. You had to have the right weather conditions. If it started to storm, you were stuck on one side or the other. It could take a very long time to cross. You could end up blowing into today's Governor's Island. You think commutes are bad today. I mean, it could really be, like a pain to get back and forth. And because of that, then, he would go into business with the steam ferry developer and inventor, Robert Fulton, who got a 25-year lease to run his New York and Brooklyn steam ferry boat company to run the service between today's Fulton Ferry Landing over to the area of today's South Street Seaport.
And so when was the opening date? When did service start here for the ferry?
It launched on May 10th, 1814. The ferry was named the Nassau, and it on that day carried in its maiden voyage across the East River 549 passengers, 1 wagon, and 3 horses. The New York Times journalist Sam Roberts wrote about that first trip a few years ago, and he quoted a newspaper account at the time, quote, "This noble boat surpassed expectations of the public in the rapidity of her movements, as those on board glided across the unpredictable river as gracefully as if they were passing over a bridge."
And so this was just between New York and Brooklyn, right?
That's right.
And how long did this take?
He cut the commuting time in half. It was now just 12 minutes to get across. Tickets were 4 cents, although you could buy an annual commutation pass for $10. And just like that, the commuter was born.
And Fulton is, of course, largely the one associated with this great innovation, but Pierpont himself really had a hand in it, right?
Yeah, he was the chief investor, and he would even later become very active in running the company. He would become the president of the company at one point. And plus, he used his influence then to pressure the state of New York to officially charter the village of Brooklyn in 1816, which made it the first urban development in Kings County with a population of 4,000 residents. And that meant then that, the village of Brooklyn could go off and pave streets and do other kind of municipal activities.
And was that essentially just around the ferry landing and up here on Clover Hill?
Right, and also along the waterfront in both directions from the ferry. So today, it's kind of, in a way, hard to imagine because you have to take away the bridges, you have to take away the BQE, Cadman Plaza, and then just imagine, those first streets and sort of clusters of homes that were growing out from around that ferry landing. In a way, it encompasses several of today's neighborhoods of Brooklyn. You've got parts of Dumbo, parts of downtown Brooklyn, and Brooklyn Heights, all around the ferry. Yeah. But once that regular ferry service started in 1814, development would actually follow very quickly.
With the opening of the Fulton Ferry, Brooklyn Heights, and in fact, all of Brooklyn begins to grow. More history after this. Just a quick reminder to click subscribe to the Bowery Boys podcast. That way you don't miss an episode.
We're releasing new episodes all the time, including a brand new episode every 2 weeks.
And to become part of the show, join us over at patreon.com/Bowery Boys. We have a ton of perks, including exclusive audio. Our patron support makes this show possible.
And we would love to also have you join us on one of our walking tours at BoweryBoysWalks.com. You can join a public walking tour or book a private one all to yourself.
I assume that more people, because they had greater access to coming to Brooklyn, then decided that they wanted to perhaps live here. And so did these landowners here in Clover Hill, here on the Heights, did they just start selling off their land?
So imagine you've got the Hicks brothers in the north, right, with that big swath of land, and you've got Pierpont south of them and several other landowners. They didn't all agree exactly on the general direction for the neighborhood. In the northern Heights, the Hicks wanted and imagined a neighborhood of smaller lots and more affordable development. They imagined an area that was attracted to people who already lived in the area, people who were working down on the docks or who were artisans. But south of them, Pierpont wanted larger lots for more refined homes. He wanted as well to set minimum standards for development, to ensure that his development would be really upscale.
And meanwhile, are any of these estates linked by actual official streets? Because there is no grand urban plan here, right? So they all must be kind of sort of organically developed paths and streets.
Yes, some streets already existed by the time the ferry started service. According to Robert Furman in his book, Brooklyn Heights, The Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of America's First Suburb, in 1806, the Hicks brothers had laid out a street and named it for their relatives, the Middaws. Mm-hmm. And around the same time, they laid out a bunch of fruit-themed streets as well, perhaps to promote their own family business, which was in selling fruit.
I presume they sold cranberries.
They sold cranberries. They must have sold pineapples.
Well, yeah, an exotic fruit that actually denotes wealth.
And then, of course, they sold oranges.
And those are the 3 fruit streets in Brooklyn Heights.
In 1810, they would also lay out Willow Street and Henry Street. And then, of course, there was Hicks Street named for themselves.
So the streets were already here. Some of these streets were already here by the time the ferry opened.
In the northern part of today's Brooklyn Heights.
Okay.
Which explains why the oldest, wooden frame structures in Brooklyn Heights are mostly located in this northern section because it's the oldest, and those were also more affordable houses that were constructed.
If that was the Hicks, what's Pierpont doing south of here?
Well, he would get into the game a few years later. He opened up Pierpont Street in 1820, but by that point, Hicks Street was already developed. According to the excellent book Old Brooklyn Heights, New York's First Suburb by Clay Lancaster, Gabriel Furman in 1821 noted 31 dwellings, 2 groceries, 1 schoolhouse, and 2 stables on Hicks Street. So to put that in perspective, when Pierpont Street was laid out for the first time, Hicks Street was already pretty developed. Mm-hmm. And plus, he pointed out that Pierpont Street was not actually open to development until 1832. So not to get too bogged down in dates here, but let's just say that Pierpont in many ways kind of like held off and waited a little bit to develop, perhaps waiting for the ferry service to kind of catch on.
To advance itself, right.
And for this area to become desirable by people with money. Around the same time, he would open up Constable Street, which he would later rename Montague after the Lady Wortley Montague, an English author who was actually a relative of the Pierponts. And then in 1826, as the city was jubilant and celebrating the opening of the Erie Canal, he ran Clinton Street through his property and named it after DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York, father of the Erie Canal. And through the 1820s, he was promoting and in real estate ads in the newspapers his lots that were for sale as well, writing that they offered, quote, the nearest country retreat with all the advantages of the country and most of the conveniences of the city.
And thus we have the ingredients for what would become the first suburb.
Right.
Now, you name-dropped DeWitt Clinton here.
As I'm wont to do.
So with the Erie Canal opening by the 1830s, there is so much prosperity entering into New York Harbor. And we mostly frame that as a story of New York's prosperity. But some of that, of course, spills over here onto the banks of Brooklyn.
Yeah, and because think of all the new business that was coming to the docks in Brooklyn and in the warehouses and storage for those canal boats that were floating up and down the Hudson, which led to increased business in the factories in Brooklyn as well. So businesses are flourishing in Lower Manhattan, and maybe some of those business owners flush with cash are looking for a nice country estate or retreat for their families. The growing prosperity of New York was good for Brooklyn and was good for Pierpont and the future of Brooklyn Heights. And let us not forget that the city's not just getting bigger and busier, but it's also getting more crowded, which brings with it sickness. So there were all kinds of reasons why people might want to escape the city and live, a short commute away.
Well, many people chose to move up to the northern areas of, say, Greenwich Village. For many others, Brooklyn became an option.
And in 1834, the village of Brooklyn expanded to become the city of Brooklyn, now with a population in 1834 of 24,000 people. This meant that it would be able to grow more easily, acquire new lands, and that full-scale development was about to take off throughout the entire city of Brooklyn, but also right up here in Brooklyn Heights.
It's at this point that the story veers off from the actual development of the city of Brooklyn, which will expand well into Long Island. It will also, in a way, be the birth of Brooklyn Heights as a center for Brooklyn society. Here's a rather extraordinary fact that sort of underscores the growth of this neighborhood. In the early 18-teens, here in the area of Brooklyn Heights, there were less than 10 houses.
That isn't very many.
No. By the start of the Civil War, there are 600 houses in just this contained area. Now, all of this has to do with the increasing prosperity of the area from the 30s into the 1840s into the 1850s. You have many more merchants who are still working down in Lower Manhattan who don't want to live all the way up north on Manhattan Island in New York. It just makes more sense to live over here in Brooklyn. And of course, if you have a little extra money, to live here in Brooklyn Heights.
But still here in the 1830s, the Fulton Steam Ferry is the only steam ferry that's operating between Brooklyn and New York?
Yeah, for many years it was the only game in town, but a couple more ferries do enter the picture here into the 1840s and 1850s, the Wall Street ferry service, and then later the South ferry service. This grows Brooklyn exponentially. And soon here in the Heights, this would become known as Brooklyn's wealthy enclave, an alternative to Fifth Avenue, with all of the old families that we just mentioned in their old homes, but also a lot of these new merchants, like Nouveau Riche, would move in here, and they would develop homes here. And what's so interesting is that most of the people who lived in Brooklyn Heights, most of the men worked in New York. So it's thus becoming truly the first official suburb of New York City.
And to be clear, just to define the word suburb, you mean a commuter's town, a bedroom community for people to come back to after working.
Yeah, most people who lived here in this area did not work in this area. They worked over there in New York. Now, over these decades, there would be an incredible diverse array of housing styles, which thankfully today you can see and compare because most of them are still there. Greek and Gothic revival, Renaissance revival, Italianate, and then, of course, the Federal style, which is a very predominant form of architecture here in Brooklyn Heights. Many spacious backyards, stables, and handsome stairs stepping down into the cobblestone streets.
And all those styles that you just kind of rolled through were popular in different eras, too.
Yes.
So they belong to different eras.
Well, they would bleed into each other and would sometimes be hybrids of all those different kinds of styles, influenced by their neighbors. You know, each person was developing their own mansion or their own house here. So it was whatever their personal preference was.
But again, the northern part, the old Hicks estate of Brooklyn Heights, was home to many, simpler, more modest wooden framed homes.
Yeah, it's striking to walk from the oldest section, and actually the housing isn't as ornate or as fancy as it is as you get more south, where it's more brownstones and a lot more luxurious. Of course, there was a huge fire in Brooklyn Heights in September of 1848, and not surprisingly, it swept through a lot of that older section because of all of those wooden structures. It destroyed 7 blocks of homes. But for the most part, the houses that you see in this neighborhood were the first homes to be built on these plots of land.
But back in New York, then by the 1840s, you have the most affluent New Yorkers who are building homes, at the base of Fifth Avenue, starting to creep up Fifth Avenue, which is kind of right in the middle of that city.
It's literally in the middle of the island, yeah.
But over here, these affluent residents are actually not in the middle of Brooklyn's development, but they're kind of perched up here on this plateau.
Yeah, it's almost like an isolated pocket, which would only become slightly more removed in 1848 with the development of Brooklyn City Hall, just further east of this area, which would create a whole civic district and commercial center and would block off Brooklyn Heights, in a sense, as this ultra-wealthy enclave.
And was there any crossover between the families of Fifth Avenue and the families of Brooklyn Heights?
There wasn't, actually, which is interesting. We had improved transportation, but it still wasn't so great that there was a lot of mobility. You had a parallel class of elites up here, many tracing from original Brooklyn families, others from the new merchant class. As Brooklyn grows larger into Long Island, the Brooklyn aristocratic class here becomes more conservative on one hand, but also provincial and actually looked down upon by many in New York. Even by 1860, they're kind of looked down upon by Fifth Avenue high society. 1860, when Brooklyn grows to become the 3rd largest city in the United States. But because they're not New York, they're still looked down upon.
What a bunch of snobs.
I know.
And kind of just generally annoying. There were also just middle-class Brooklynites, too, who were moving to this area.
And this area became attractive to them as well. And so by the 1850s, these new developments spread further south of here, furthering that grid plan past Atlantic Avenue and developing neighborhoods that today we call Cobble Hill and Carroll Gardens.
And the streets of Brooklyn Heights, then, like Clinton Street, would just continue south right into those neighborhoods.
Yeah, they would stretch even further south and become, quite lengthy. In total, this whole area, including Red Hook and Gowanus and later Park Slope when it would be developed, all of this would be called South Brooklyn because all of it is south of the original village. Although today, there's so much more Brooklyn that's even more south of South Brooklyn.
But let's go back up to the height of Brooklyn Heights. when you're up on that perch, and then you said it kind of sloped down
Yes.
to the water. What was going on there? Was anything actually on that kind of rugged slope?
Yeah, I mean, it was impossible to build upon the slope, right? But then...
It was irregular.
Yes. I mean, you would walk down to the waterfront, but it was not often easy. Well, in 1854... there was actually a very romantic bridge that was constructed from Montague Street to the waterfront that allowed for easier access to the waterfront, and of course to get to these ferries, in particular to the Wall Street ferry landing that was down by the waterfront.
Which was at the base of Montague Street.
Yes.
When Montague continued to the water.
When it was at the water, right. So this bridge allowed you to get there easier. It was designed by an architect whose name is all over the neighborhood. He's probably the defining architect. His name is Menard Lefevre.
Much of Brooklyn Heights, in fact, had caught Lefevre.
They had the fever for Lefevre. This bridge was so lovely and so adored that people came from miles around just to cross the bridge. It had a kind of a romantic flair about it. But I would say by the 1850s, now you had a couple decades of development here, that the neighborhood now had some very significant aspects about it that recommended it as a place to visit. For instance, Brooklyn Heights was the home of one of America's most popular newspapers, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which began publication in 1841. Their offices would be located on what is today 28 Old Fulton Street. Now, as we stated in our Walt Whitman show, he was an editor at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle for 2 years.
We talked a lot about, I guess, Brooklyn Heights and Brooklyn's development because he was an editor here, but his whole family even helped.
Well, they built houses all over, including many here in Brooklyn Heights.
His father was an early developer.
Yeah. Another incredibly appealing feature to Brooklyn Heights was the great number of churches.
Earning Brooklyn, in fact, the nickname City of Churches.
Yeah, I mean, it is frequently used in newspapers of the 19th century for Brooklyn itself. For instance, I just found this very amusing. In the Daily Eagle, in an article in 1857, there was an article on a controversial proposal to keep businesses open on Sunday. The article says, quote, "Shall Brooklyn, the city of churches, be the first to set the example of desecrating that day which all Christians throughout the world unite in keeping holy? Cries, no, no." So they were very, very proud of this particular title.
What were some of the churches that opened during this period?
Some of the notable churches included the Holy Trinity Church on Montague, which opened in 1847, and featured the highest spire, the tallest structure in the neighborhood. It could be seen by sailors out in the New York harbor. It was a church that was also designed by Menard Lefevre. There are many more churches. Brooklyn has its own Grace Church, which opened here in the mid-19th century. There were many others. Some of them have since been demolished. Some of them today have been turned into condos.
Well, when the neighborhood is protected like it is, you can't just rip a church down.
No.
You gotta move in.
No, so there's a lot of people who live in old churches in Brooklyn Heights.
And when you look at paintings of the Brooklyn skyline, like from Manhattan's point of view,
yeah.
From this era, you see all of those steeples, which does kind of like paint a picture of a very conservative city. More conservative, one would imagine, than New York.
But by conservative, we sort of mean old school conservative, as in reserved, right? No party animals in Brooklyn, I guess one way to say it. But the missions of many of these churches during this period would have been considered very radical for the day. Many here were involved, for instance, in the abolitionist movement, the efforts by people in these ministries to rescue escaped enslaved people from the South and then to house them in spaces along the Underground Railroad. Now, we have a whole show on the Underground Railroad, and in that show, we feature the most renowned church of Brooklyn Heights. That would be Plymouth Church. This was a Congregationalist church founded in 1843 by friends of the abolitionist brothers Arthur and Lewis Tappan. But in October of 1847, they imported a firebrand minister of great renown named Henry Ward Beecher. And it was here at this church that he became one of the most famous men in America, but actually very intimately connected with this neighborhood.
He was so popular. His sermons were read in newspapers around the country. He was a household name, Beecher was, and so popular, in fact, that they had to run special, quote, Beecher boats to get people ferried back and forth between New York.
Yeah, that was the nickname. I mean, so he was not only this incredibly famous minister, but he was also a real salesman for Brooklyn Heights itself. From Debbie Applegate's book called The Most Famous Man in America, which is a biography of Henry Ward Beecher, quote, "The pastor was one of the few men on the Heights who did not work in Manhattan, leaving him plenty of time to call upon the ladies of the church. He poked around the docks talking to sailors and ferry pilots. On Fulton Street, he stopped to chat with local men, absorbing the politics and personalities of Brooklyn." So I would say by 1860 that this growing, thriving, upscale neighborhood of Brooklyn was best known to the world by the Brooklyn Daily Eagle and by Henry Ward Beecher.
When you visit the neighborhood today, I think the dominant thing that pops out at you is actually the beautiful homes.
Mm-hmm.
When you stroll the streets of Brooklyn Heights today. And during this next period, from the 1860s until the early 1880s, you saw the construction of many more of these fine, luxurious homes, townhouses. Many of them were constructed in the Renaissance Revival style and also in the Venetian Gothic style. That Renaissance Revival style, according to Clay Lancaster, is characterized by, quote, "a certain opulence manifesting itself in an increased scale and an abundance of ornamentation, especially around openings. Some of these features, such as capitals, friezes, and consoles, are embellished with lush carvings of acanthus leaves and less orthodox forms of vegetation."
This is why Brooklyn Heights is kind of made for the autumn when the leaves change, because all of that rich brownstones and red bricks combined with all of the trees, because there's a lot of trees in Brooklyn Heights. Mm-hmm. It's so picturesque.
But we should point out that by the 1860s, there were still some parts of Brooklyn Heights that were hardly even developed at all, kind of surprisingly. For example, Robert Furman, in his book, points out that a map from the late 1860s shows that most of Montague Street's north side had hardly any development at all, because that side of the block was actually functioning as backyards for the luxurious homes over on Pierpont. Mm-hmm.
But now, many decades into the life of Brooklyn Heights here, these families were not just developing large homes, they were now developing institutions that they could visit and appreciate.
As was that parallel society over across the river. They were starting a bunch of things at the same time. But actually, one of the area's first really big institutions, the Apprentices' Library, had been formed back in the 1820s. It was formed for the purposes of, quote, "forming a repository of books, maps, pictures, drawing apparatus, models of machinery, tools, and implements, all collected for enlarging knowledge in literature, science, and art, and thereby improving the condition of mechanics, manufacturers, artisans, and others." And
by Apprentices' Library, I assume it's for apprentices to further enrich themselves, like working class, middle class men, to visit and develop their intellect and curiosity about life.
That's right. And also keep them out of the bars, keep them on the right path. And it was erected at Henry Street and Cranberry in that northern section with great pomp and ceremony back in 1825. And its cornerstone was actually laid by the Marquis de Lafayette when he was visiting New York on that big...
Wow, I was like, what is he doing in town?
Now, this is back in 1825. And during that ceremony, you might recall, we mentioned in the Whitman show, that it was during that ceremony, schools were let out. The kids all went to watch Lafayette lay this cornerstone, and Walt Whitman himself was lifted into the air and kissed on the head by Lafayette.
And so the Apprentices Library, was one of the first institutions of Brooklyn Heights.
Right, and it would actually sort of live on and morph, in the following decades, leading to the creation of several other important institutions that would ultimately have names that we still know today, like the Brooklyn Museum, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and the Brooklyn Children's Museum. Those all trace their lineages back to this Apprentices Library.
Wow, there's spin-offs. But was there an actual library for, the residents to check out books, though?
Yes. In 1852, a group formed the Brooklyn Athenaeum and Reading Room in a 3-story building at the corner of Atlantic and Clinton Streets. And this was centered more on like a business class of men, also to keep them probably out of the bars, but people who had already had more classical education. This was to keep them sort of intellectually stimulated as they sort of launched into their careers.
I just have to add that as a former resident of Cobble Hill, I am aware of the spot where this stood because it is the location of a Key Foods where I would get my groceries. It was on the very spot of the Athenaeum.
Does that Key Foods have a 2,000-seat auditorium, Greg?
It had a good produce section, but I didn't see an auditorium anywhere.
Well, later that decade, a group formed the Brooklyn Mercantile Library Association, which operated out of the Athenaeum before merging those two libraries in 1869, follow me here, into one library that was located at 197 Montague Street.
All right, so still in this area.
A new kind of merged library. Well, in 1878, that would be renamed the Brooklyn Public Library.
Wow, so the Brooklyn Public Library is born in Brooklyn Heights.
Well, today's official Brooklyn Public Library would actually be formed in 1896.
Oh.
It would be chartered by the state legislature of New York. But yeah, that name traces back to these organizations.
All of this history passing before my eyes here.
It kind of makes you wish that there was a place to keep it all, doesn't it?
All this history?
Yeah. Think about how actually these civic leaders felt, because many of them had literally seen the neighborhood and the city just like develop before their eyes. They thought that, yes, this story needed to be preserved. And so in 1863, prominent citizens here, including Henry Pierpont, Hezekiah's son, formed the Long Island Historical Society with the stated goal of, quote, preserving the history of America, New York State, and most important, the counties, towns, and villages of Long Island.
The Long Island Historical Society.
That's right.
And they were also here in the neighborhood?
Yeah, well, first they operated out of some rooms on Court Street, but then they acquired land at Pierpont and Clinton Streets. And in 1878, they held a design contest to, design their new headquarters. And that was won by George Post, who was the architect of the Vanderbilt Mansion. He also designed the New York Stock Exchange building.
Oh, yeah, one of the great architects of the Gilded Age.
Right. And his Renaissance Revival brick and terracotta building opened in 1881, and a century later would change its name to the Brooklyn Historical Society.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, we are frequently at the Brooklyn Historical Society, but if you step back and look at the beautiful exterior of the building, you'll still see the words Long Island Historical Society written upon it. So you have all this culture, now we have libraries, now we have history. What if you live in Brooklyn Heights and you want to go out for like a night of fun?
Well, fun in this conservative enclave meant taking in perhaps a concert at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. Again, the story is that prominent citizens came together in the 1850s to form the Philharmonic Society of Brooklyn, and then raised money to construct the Academy of Music, which was located on the south side of Montague Street at Clinton Street and opened in 1861. And this, too, included an auditorium that sat over 2,000 people. The Brooklyn Academy of Music would be a fixture of Brooklyn's cultural scene, cultural world. And this would remain a fixture of the neighborhood. As Brooklyn would grow in all directions, from it, people would still flock here to Montague Street.
And so all of these things that you've talked about, there's parallel versions of them across the water in New York. And the important thing to remember is by this point, by 1860, Brooklyn is the third largest city in America. So it's almost like a just more conservative, more sober version of all of those different types of institutions, wouldn't you say?
Well, there were some, rather tawdry things happening over here in Brooklyn Heights. You mentioned Henry Ward Beecher before, and I think you even mentioned that he enjoyed being,
The company of ladies?
in the company of ladies, particularly those who were his congregants, and perhaps didn't mind that many or most of their husbands left for the island of Manhattan during the day. We don't have time to go into what went down with Henry Ward Beecher and the scandals that arose in the 1870s. But let's just say the brief version is that Beecher was accused of having an affair with a woman named Elizabeth Tilton, who was the wife of one of his best friends and colleagues, Theodore Tilton. What makes the story extra special is that it also features prominently Victoria Woodhull, who was an early feminist leader. She was spiritualist. She was a proponent of free love and much more. She was frustrated with Beecher for what she saw as his hypocrisy and accused him very publicly of having many affairs with his congregants, including with Mrs. Tilton. And then to drive it all home, she even published all the details in her own magazine, which quickly sold out of 150,000 copies. It caused a huge sensation, not just here in sleepy, quote-unquote, conservative Brooklyn Heights, but throughout the country.
Yeah.
Leading to a big trial that everybody followed in 1875, at which Beecher was acquitted, finally. And of course, he managed to somehow brand himself the victim of the entire thing.
Now, if you'd like more of the grittier details of that, there's an old Bowery Boys podcast on the life of Henry Ward Beecher, which we'll put up on the website. But in total, Tom, you've now given us the highs and lows of Brooklyn Heights entering into the Gilded Age here. Now, is there anything major that we missed?
Well, there was actually something else, Greg, that was looming over the neighborhood, or perhaps more accurately, it was looming over the blocks just north of here. Both New York and Brooklyn were growing very, very quickly, and because of immigration, but also because of all of the industry that was happening here in Brooklyn and along the waterfront and all the factories. But all of that traffic was getting jammed down here at the water's edge. Imagine that everybody had to wait for one of those ferries to go back and forth. So it had become clear by the 1860s that a bridge, some kind of massive bridge, would need to be constructed to link these two great cities.
It would be in both of their interests, these two major cities, if they could just have an easier way to get around and get between each other.
Construction took 14 years. The bridge would open in 1883. And that story does take place north of Brooklyn Heights, although, Washington and Emily Roebling did live on Columbia Heights and would also supervise from here in Brooklyn Heights.
Oh, yeah, you would have with ease been able to see the construction. And they saw the entire bridge rising out of the water.
After the bridge opened in 1883, it became clear that the bridge could help both cities grow in different respects, especially once rail service headed over the bridge as well. Development could really pick up speed farther into the city of Brooklyn. But what would that mean for Brooklyn Heights? How would that affect this rather affluent enclave?
Now, for many, this is where the story of Brooklyn Heights really gets good. Right? Because the kind of interesting twists and turns that happened in the neighborhood could not possibly have been predicted by the old Hicks brothers or by Menard Lefevre.
Brooklyn joins Greater New York, and the Village Bohemians arrive right after this.
So we have the Brooklyn Bridge, which is going to change both New York, the cities of New York and Brooklyn. What are the specific changes that happen in the immediate aftermath of its opening in 1883?
Well, the biggest change really happens about a decade later, of course, with the biggest change to affect Brooklyn in general. So let's just start with the really big picture thing. That is, of course, the event that took place on January 1st, 1898, when Brooklyn ceased to be the city of Brooklyn and became the borough of Brooklyn, the consolidation of Greater New York. That brought with it, all the bureaucratic changes that came with the reshuffling of the government. City Hall became
borough hall. Brooklyn's mayor became the borough president. There were those kinds of changes.
And meanwhile, the population of Brooklyn has grown so drastically and rapidly.
Oh, if you look at 1880, okay, Brooklyn was home to about 600,000 people. By 1900, 20 years later, it was home to 1.16 million. And then 20 years after that, in 1920, 2 million people. So within the short span of 40 years, Brooklyn's population had more than tripled. And let me tell you, listener, all of those new people were not living in Brooklyn Heights.
No, not at all, because now they could travel far and wide, well into the entire borough, which is now coterminous with Kings County, and would soon have many more bridges to travel over.
Right. And they could travel over those bridges or even get to those bridges on the new elevated railroads. By the late 19th century, downtown Brooklyn had become crisscrossed, with various elevated railways and street trams. And those were bringing these new residents who lived farther afield into downtown Brooklyn to do their shopping, to go to the new department stores that were opening, or to transfer at the Sand Street station, which was located near Brooklyn Bridge, onto another street tram that went over the Brooklyn Bridge. It also sort of pushed the commercial hub away from Brooklyn Heights, because of all this activity, into downtown Brooklyn, mostly along Fulton Street, where Fulton Street extended past City Hall, or shall I say Borough Hall.
And then just a few years later, after Consolidation, you had the opening of the very first subway in Manhattan in 1904, and that would soon expand into Brooklyn as well. And that would only help supercharge this population explosion as well.
If the elevated rail was easy, now the subway that extended into Brooklyn by 1908 made it only easier for people to live and work in Brooklyn. That first stop, by the way, in 1908 in Brooklyn was today's 4-5 stop at Borough Hall.
Now, what I understand about the residents of Brooklyn Heights up to this point, that maybe some in that community would not exactly be thrilled that Brooklyn is filled with all these brand new residents from New York and from other places.
Perhaps you're talking about the old-timers that were pretty happy to have had this rather secluded, although well-connected by a steam ferry neighborhood up here on the Heights. And suddenly, especially, once those subways are opening, people from all over the city are easily accessing their neighborhood. And as you'll talk about, in the next decade or two, more lines would open up in the neighborhood.
It almost makes you feel kind of sorry for that little old, rusty ferry steaming along down there at the foot of Brooklyn Heights.
Well, those ferries, they were no longer needed and they would go out of business. Ironically, they were the very thing that had made this neighborhood possible, and now they would just sort of fade away.
So Brooklyn Heights is attempting to modernize in some ways, right, though?
Whether it wants to or not.
Right. So it's still a destination for lovely homes, I'm assuming?
Yeah. By the 1880s, there were new arrivals. New apartment buildings were sprouting up. They had become acceptable. They've become more in vogue and acceptable, not just here, but in other new neighborhoods in Brooklyn and obviously over in Manhattan as well. Apartment buildings would go up on Montague and on other streets near it, replacing old homes. And we're talking about both luxurious apartment buildings, but also middle-class apartments as well.
Well, by this point, say around the 1890s, right, there are other destinations for people of wealth in Brooklyn. There are other wealthy neighborhoods in Brooklyn.
Like Park Slope, Prospect Heights, Bedford-Stuyvesant. These were new neighborhoods where people were building elegant homes, and increasingly into the early 20th century, those homes could also accommodate those newfangled automobiles.
Oh, of course. And let us not forget, since we're talking apartments here, that it was rather fashionable during this period to also live in a hotel or a residential hotel.
Yeah, because also all those old homes were very expensive to run, and to keep staffed. I mean, Greg, the staffing costs alone, just don't you just feel so sorry for them?
Look, I've seen Downton Abbey.
Just that staff starts dwindling. Pretty soon it's just the cook in the kitchen by herself.
Who's going to dust all the cutlery?
I don't even know which bell chain to pull. So yes, hotels would start opening all over the Heights, and much like the apartment buildings, they were taking the place of these old homes. And they weren't just serving these sort of long-term guests that you're mentioning, but also transient guests. These were actually functional short-term stay hotels as well. There was the St. George Hotel that opened on Clark Street in 1885, and it was named after St. George's Tavern, which had occupied that same spot during the Revolutionary War.
Ooh, it has an 18th century connection.
Yeah, and a British loyalist connection. The St. George we know today is a behemoth. You know, it grew in the 1890s, and then it became much larger in the 1920s when they put on that huge tower. For a while, it actually became the largest hotel in New York City with over 2,600 rooms and the largest ballroom in New York City.
And that's down on Clark Street, right? I mean, that's not even on that main street of Brooklyn Heights that we talked about, Montague Street.
Right. Montague was becoming the main street, but Montague had its own hotels. There was a Hotel Bossert, which had been founded by Louis Bossert at the corner of Montague and Hicks Street. Now, that structure, which still stands today, is all dolled up in the Italian Renaissance revival style. It is much fancier than that St. George's Hotel. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle called it the Waldorf Astoria of Brooklyn. The rooftop even had this sort of luxurious restaurant on 2 floors called the Marine Roof.
So Montague was this destination of like the Brooklyn Academy of Music was here. There were these other like storied institutions, but it seems now that maybe it's changing a little bit. Now we have some hotels here. What's the feeling of Montague Street?
Well, by this period, yes, it's becoming much more built up and also much more commercial. In fact, the eastern end of Montague was becoming more of a kind of banking hub, sort of like a mini Wall Street. You know, there was clearly a lot of money in Brooklyn Heights.
Oh, yeah.
So banks were constructing lovely headquarters and branches in those blocks of Montague and also on Court Street. One that I wanted to mention that's still around today that you and I just visited a few days ago, and it's so beautiful, started out as the Brooklyn Trust Company. It was built in 1915 at the northeast corner of Clinton and Montague. According to Clay Lancaster, our favorite author, in his book Old Brooklyn Heights, America's First Suburb, the building is neoclassical, and it resembles, quote, an Italian Renaissance palazzo with rusticated walls, massive arched windows, exquisitely tooled gray marble, and a vast barrel-vaulted hall richly ornamented with a coffered ceiling.
It's a breathtaking building, and it manages to remain in the banking world. It's a Chase Bank now inhabits it. In fact, the whole street is still kind of considered a bank row. There's several banks, and this just in this one area.
Now, on the other side of the street, though, we talked about the Brooklyn Academy of Music,
yes,
constructing their lovely theater on Montague in 1861. But 42 years later, on November 30th, 1903, the Brooklyn Academy of Music went up in flames. It took up the whole front page of that afternoon's Brooklyn Daily Eagle with a headline, "Fire Destroys the Academy, a few standing walls in a massive ruins where historic structure stood." Quote, "A fire that completely destroyed Brooklyn's most historic theater, the Academy of Music on Montague Street, broke out a few minutes before 9 o'clock this morning. The flames spread rapidly, and in an hour and a half, the fire had attained its height and had practically burned itself out. For the first hour of its progress, the downtown portion of Brooklyn was in commotion. Businesses came to a standstill, and a host of badly frightened folk watched the big pillar of flames and black smoke that rose above the housetops in the vicinity of Borough Hall. Amazingly, nobody was killed in this event, although, of course, you know, the cultural heart of the neighborhood had been lost.
Yeah, this is a major tragedy. This was one of the most esteemed institutions, and it's now gone. Mm-hmm. So how did they rebuild from this?
Well, as they had done decades before for its initial construction, money was raised to rebuild. But this time, Greg, and this is notable for the history of the neighborhood, this time they chose to rebuild not here in Brooklyn Heights, but something more central, the new heart of the borough, over on Lafayette Avenue.
Now, you alluded to something earlier about the kind of state of the neighborhood. And so by like 1910, This neighborhood has houses that are like 90 years old. There are a few older buildings in Brooklyn overall today, but there is no neighborhood or collection of buildings older in Brooklyn than Brooklyn Heights. And so with this expanse of a 5-borough city, and anticipating that ever-steady advancing that is now happening throughout the whole borough, many of those who lived in this community, who had lived there for decades, were concerned about being left out of kind of the riches of growth here. And this is happening in New York, too, with older communities. And just like those communities, we see here the formation of the very first neighborhood association.
Like an advocacy group.
Yes.
A neighborhood one today I can think of a lot of advocacy groups who are working on preservation efforts.
Yeah.
Especially in that neighborhood. Were they concerned already in the early 20th century with preserving the historic character of the neighborhood?
Well, it's preservation of a different kind, I would have to say. Keep in mind that these are cries from the older families that live in Brooklyn Heights, those who are trying to retain or keep that sort of class identity preserved in the neighborhood, but also to keep the neighborhood vital and connected with the rest of the city. You had slowly over the decades here, and it will continue into the 20th century, the older residents moving out and the middle class moving in.
And moving into these new apartment buildings or even into these residential hotels.
I mean, that's changing the character of the neighborhood.
So I can imagine then that some of these neighbors who lived in those existing 19th century elegant homes weren't really thrilled about that transition.
No. So in 1910, the Brooklyn Heights Association was formed. The New York Times actually covered its formation in February of 1910. And I just have to read a quote from this because these are some melodramatic people.
Okay.
This is from the vice president of the Heights Association, Reverend Newell Dwight Hillis. Quote. So they're kind of bemoaning the fact that at this point in 1910, there's not a subway station for those in Brooklyn Heights.
You have to walk all the way over to the Borough Hall.
Yes. And yet, many in this community have supported the subway and, of course, were very wealthy and in certain ways even helped fund it. Quote, "We have been more than generous and self-sacrificing. We have aided in the matter of the 4th Avenue subway, which tends to divert residents from our part of the city. We have helped everyone but ourselves. But I say to you that not even the Bible requires us to love Flatbush more than the Heights.
Bringing the Bible into this.
Our rich move away and our young find locations elsewhere. Our creed has been that everybody's better than ourselves. We have been actuated by an excess of Christian zeal. We have also been too dignified and too respectable. Let us now get up and do some shouting."
I would really love to hear the Reverend Hillis do some shouting, Greg. But you can imagine that, I guess, the residents felt like they had spent so many decades, building churches and fine cultural institutions to bring culture and spiritual guidance to the masses, that they had neglected to think about their own best interests.
They considered themselves a bedrock of society.
Well, they were located on a lot of rock.
On a lot of bedrock, actually. I should stress that even until recent years here, Brooklyn Heights is one of the New York City area's most religious communities. And I would say it is at this very moment, the moment of their formation in 1910, that we see a major personality shift from a class-based Protestant community to middle, working class, and even bohemian neighborhood, which I'll explain in a minute. Well, I should even mention that it's around this time, actually 1908, that the Watchtower Bible Society first buys property here in the area of Brooklyn Heights and some warehouses in the North Heights. They will, later in our story, make a very significant impact upon the neighborhood.
And when you say the Watchtower Bible Society.
Yes, it's not a super group. It's not a superhero group.
No. You're talking about the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yes, which is a Christian denomination that formed in the 1870s, and they're famous for using printed material as part of their ministry. We'll talk a little bit more about them later.
But back to the Bohemians, Greg.
Oh, yes.
When did they come in?
Well, surprisingly, it is largely because of a new subway station that finally opened in Brooklyn Heights. So
the B line for Bohemian?
No, actually, it's the 2-3, but we could call it the Bohemian line. It opened in 1919, the Clark Street extension of the IRT, finally delivering subway service here to Brooklyn Heights of Clark and Henry.
In the St. George, in the basement.
Yeah, the 2-3 train connecting Brooklyn not only with the Wall Street business area, which is important, but another neighborhood that would come to influence Brooklyn Heights, Greenwich Village. So as the older, wealthy, and even middle-class residents began moving out of this area, the housing stock, which is vacated, becomes more attractive to the Bohemian set who could move here and then just jump on a train to go over to the village's coffee houses and speakeasies and salons. Well, in April of 1921, the New York Tribune did an entire spread on this phenomenon, a whole spread called Greenwich Village Moves to Brooklyn. Subhead, bobbed hair is growing where frizzies grew before. Sandals soon will patter up the Clark Street station stairs. There's a wonderful article written by a woman named Hannah Mitchell about her experiences living on Columbia Heights. In the article, she actually complains that there are too many villagers already moving to the neighborhood. Quote, "Two girls with short hair took the apartment under me. I couldn't help sneaking a look at the address from which their mail was forwarded. Greenwich Village."
Egads, the horror.
Yes.
But, it does make sense, obviously, that people who had been attracted to the small town village atmosphere of Greenwich Village would also find that same kind of atmosphere here in the tree-lined streets with the beautiful homes.
And then throughout the 1920s and 30s, many more writers and artists would move into the neighborhood. And for decades, this would actually be known as the Bohemian Quarter of Brooklyn. Isn't that an extraordinary transformation?
And still sort of hard to consider today.
Yeah, I know. Incredible.
So who were these Bohemians? Any big names, bold-faced names? Six names?
There's too many to count. This is a great scavenger hunt for a day of walking around Brooklyn Heights. Just walk around and look for plaques, because they're on many of the buildings, and they all identify just famous artists or painters that lived in these buildings. Like in the 1920s, you had H.P. Lovecraft on Clinton Street, Hart Crane on Columbia Heights. In the 1930s, Thomas Wolfe on Montague Terrace. In the 50s, you had Arthur Miller, 155 Willow Street. Then you had Truman Capote over there on 70 Willow Street.
Mm-hmm. What I love about many of these authors also wrote about their experiences living in those places in Brooklyn Heights. They were so inspired by the neighborhood that they often wrote about it.
Capote wrote beautifully about Brooklyn Heights. Then, of course, Tom, the most legendary literary house, which is sadly no longer there. It was so fabulous that, of course, it can no longer exist today. At 7 Middaw Street was nicknamed February House, which was an art commune that opened in 1940, and by many accounts was the best place to have a good time in all of Brooklyn. Imagine a party where you hung around with guests Carson McCullers, W.H. Auden, Gypsy Rose Lee, and Benjamin Britten.
What a dinner party.
Let's be honest, why hasn't this been turned into a film or a TV show? This is prime material for a Netflix series.
But to be clear, if we're in the 1940s and there's, a somewhat active bohemian art scene in the neighborhood, clearly something has changed, right? The real estate market has changed if the bohemians have been able to afford moving in. And I'm assuming then that the Great Depression of the 1930s had something to do with that.
It certainly did. In fact, the Depression almost spells the end of Brooklyn Heights. In most of the things that I read, they referred to Brooklyn Heights in the 1940s as a slum.
Again, an inconceivable way to describe that neighborhood today.
So during Prohibition, as these bohemian groups moved in, you also had working class ethnic groups like the Italians moving in who were fleeing Manhattan's Italian quarter, which was quite overcrowded at this time. According to author Robert Furman, 1/3 of the houses by this time, by the Depression, were completely vacant and foreclosed upon.
It's a miracle that those weren't demolished. I mean, considering, the sort of slum clearance that started heating up in the 30s and 40s.
Well, many were destroyed, actually, east of Old Fulton Street with the development of Cadman Plaza, and that Brooklyn Civic District was built up then in the 1930s. But before I move on, I just need to make mention of one moment of sports history.
Not exactly, of course, the first thing that pops into my mind when I think of Brooklyn Heights.
No, but the Brooklyn Dodgers are around and beloved and naturally stayed in all of these local hotels, as did visiting teams. By the 1950s, in fact, many of the Dodgers lived at the Hotel Bossert.
Oh.
Which is kind of amazing.
And weren't there offices also here, down on Montague?
Yes, just down the street on Montague and Court. The front office was located from 1938 to 1957, and it is here on August 28th, 1945, that general manager Branch Rickey signed Jackie Robinson to the Dodgers, breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball. And then Robinson would eventually go on to play with the Dodgers in 1947. But we still have not gotten into the big drama here.
The biggest plans that are heading toward Brooklyn Heights. We'll get to that story after this. So, Greg, this brings us to probably, one of the most famous aspects or features of Brooklyn Heights, the Promenade, or its official title, or at least at the beginning, the Esplanade.
One of the most popular attractions in Brooklyn for thousands of people every weekend.
Right. This is a 5-block-long walk along Brooklyn Heights, overlooking the East River, and popular, as you said, because it offers these majestic views of Lower Manhattan.
What's interesting about the Promenade is it feels like it was built for Brooklyn Heights from the beginning.
And actually, early on, there were some little viewing areas at the end of those streets, at the end of Pierpont, at the end of Montague, seating, where you could look out, but they stopped there. You couldn't really walk anywhere.
Many of those Columbia Heights residents didn't really want to share that view anyway, and their backyards were just unique in that they were part of that slope. In fact, they would slope all the way down to the warehouses. On Winter's Day, children would literally slide down it, right, and down top of the rooftop.
And, we haven't really spent much time talking about Furman Street, which is down below the rocky outcropping there. Furman Street down below had warehouses on both sides, on the east side and on the west side. But on the east side there, some of the Columbia Heights residents built gardens atop those warehouses that were down below. And they quite liked having their backyards to themselves. Now, there had been earlier attempts, all the way back to the days of Hezekiah Pierpont in the 1820s. He tried to get some of his neighbors on Columbia Heights to sort of join up and create some kind of promenade. But again, they weren't interested in having people walking by their back windows. And then in the 1840s, even Walt Whitman would write about the need for some kind of a walk. He dreamed about having a walk up in Brooklyn Heights for strolling.
So it had been imagined in the 19th century.
Right. But it's interesting then that it would have to wait until the 1940s, really, for it to come about.
Well, if we're in the 1940s and it's a new construction, might Robert Moses be popping his head into the story here?
Yeah, he had been active building, highways and parkways by this time. By 1940, he was planning a larger expressway that could finally connect Brooklyn and Queens. Or should I say, Greg, a Brooklyn-Queens expressway. He would find funding for this project in 1940s from the federal government because he would say that there was a military benefit to it, that the government should fund it because if necessary, it could move troops.
Any excuse he could use to get money, federal money for things.
But by the early 40s, and the plans were starting to come out about what shape this Brooklyn and Queens expressway would take.
And how specifically would those plans affect this neighborhood?
Well, Let me read to you, Greg, from an oft-quoted article in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle from September 19th, 1942. Headline, Plan for Express Highway Through Heights is Shocking. Brooklynites were shocked to learn that serious consideration was being given to a proposal to cut an express highway through the heart of the Heights. And then the article goes on to state that, they were facing this traffic dilemma. The new expressway would be coming up Hicks Street in Cobble Hill, and the planners, in this case Moses, wanted to get it over to the newly widened Tillery Street in downtown. So what Moses was proposing here was to continue running the expressway north of Atlantic Avenue along Hicks Street up to around Pierpont, and then hooking to the east to join into Tillery.
Well, that kind of sounds like it's going to cut Brooklyn Heights completely in two with a massive highway just like speeding through it.
Right, and that would have demolished many, blocks of beautiful old homes and, chopped the neighborhood into two. The article continues, a, quote, more logical scheme would be to swing around by way of Furman Street along the river on an elevated structure similar to the West Side Highway. First of all, let's just take note of the fact that nothing was really mentioned about the folks living down in Cobble Hill, right? And the impending construction of what would become known as the ditch, They obviously didn't have the political connections or the power really to do anything to help save their neighborhood. Why hadn't the highway been moved west of Hicks Street? It could have been, running along the waterfront over there. And I think it's also shocking to us today because you see how the city was just imposing this kind of a plan. The master builder was doing his thing with really minimal oversight. It wasn't like they were having big public hearings and getting community board feedback on these plans.
Oh, no, that's not a Moses way of doing things.
Fortunately, he would have to contend with the Heights Association. But yeah, it's also interesting that in this article, the Eagle is advocating for an elevated highway. It doesn't mention, however, that elevated highway would be on two levels. And it certainly doesn't mention any kind of a promenade on top of it.
Did he hear any complaints or concerns from the community at all?
Yes, and he scowled at all.
Of course.
No, there was a public hearing, one public hearing, on March 10th, 1943. And at that hearing, the city showed off plans to run the highway on one level directly behind the houses of Columbia Heights. So they had actually adapted their plan, and they had dropped the Hicks extension north of Atlantic.
And did they drop that because of the political pressure from the Heights Association? Or
Well, a lot of this is kind of unclear to us today. It probably played into Moses's decision, but their official line was that they were moving the BQE farther west and along Furman Street because it would have been too expensive to acquire all of the land of those fine homes.
Okay.
The acquisition of land would have been just too pricey.
And that's probably true as well. And then where did the idea come from to then take the highway, lower it, and then cover it?
Henrik Krogius, who studied the promenade and wrote about its history for years, published in 2011 the definitive book on the subject called The Brooklyn Heights Promenade. He writes about two Brooklyn Heights Association leaders and who were neighbors on Columbia Heights, Roy Richardson and Fred Nitardi. And these men spoke at the hearing, this one hearing in 1943. They spoke to Robert Moses, and they proposed to Moses to put the highway on two levels above Furman Street. And Nitardi actually asked that it be covered with a garden to replace the garden that would be taken away from him.
But this sounds like he wanted to be some kind of a private garden, not for the public.
Right. That's true. And it kind of makes sense because his private garden was being, taken
It was his land.
taken away from him.
Yeah.
But alas, he would find out the next month in April of 1943 that the two-level highway would be topped by a public esplanade. Initially, it was planned for between Cranberry Street to around Grace Court, but it would turn out that it would extend from Remsen all the way up to Orange Street. Now, Nitardi, who was, according to Krogius, wasn't thrilled about losing his backyard garden, and many of those Brooklyn Heights neighbors were not thrilled at all about having thousands now of pedestrians and visitors passing by their back windows.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and to this day, people are marveling at these houses, which, of course, people still live in.
Right, looking right in those windows.
Uh-huh. So who ultimately came up with this idea?
Well, as Krogius points out in his book, lots of people took credit for it, once it had been opened and proved to be such a hit. But there are a lot of mysteries that still surround how it got pushed all the way over here, how it was built, on 2 levels, cantilevered above Furman Street, which was an engineering marvel, and how it was decided to top it with this wonderful esplanade.
When was work finally started here on the promenade?
Well, construction was delayed because of the war. But in 1946, they started by ripping down the warehouses that were on the east side of Furman Street. And 4 years later, on October 7th, 1950, the first section of the promenade opened, the section south of Clark Street.
So it's a little bit like the High Line, because they opened it in different years.
Right.
They progressed. Was there a big party?
Oh, yeah, complete with Robert Moses and the borough president, John Cashmore, and many other notable people. Everybody agreed on one thing, Greg. Those views were spectacular. We have a clip of the opening ceremony, this audio courtesy of the New York City Municipal Archives.
At one of the most beautiful sites anywhere in the world, which used to be in colonial days the site of the residence known as the Chimneys, which George Washington occupied, and which was connected with the historic Battle of Long Island, and overlooking the magnificent New York Bay, one of the greatest panoramas in the world. The members of the Board of Estimate, the President of the Borough of Brooklyn, and the Department of Parks today are dedicating the Brooklyn Heights Promenade above the shelves here on Furman Street, Brooklyn.
And as this beautiful panorama unfolds before us in a view of the harbor and skyline of New York, I think it proves once and for all the truth of the old adage which says, if you want to see New York, you have to go to Brooklyn.
And that was Borough President Cashmore speaking.
So yeah, they understood that the views were spectacular. And they would celebrate once again the next year in December of 1951 when the northern section of the promenade opened.
So the promenade is now open, but the BQE is not yet opened underneath it. How peaceful.
Well, peaceful. I mean, there was a lot of work for a number of years going on to build that massive cantilevered 2-level expressway. But no, this portion of the BQE would not be completed until 1954. But there was a lot of work going on. Ironically, just 2 years after the promenade opened, it was already at risk of losing its prominent asset, its views, because those views were at risk of being blocked by the warehouses on the west side of Furman Street, on the west side, just to the west of the promenade. Because those warehouses had been about 4 stories tall, but in 1953, the Port Authority wanted to rip those down and build new massive warehouses down there. So those would have actually blocked the view. And, there's a lot that went on, public hearings about this, Robert Moses saying, well, it can't protect a view, But they did find a way, using special zoning, to protect that view. Those warehouses on the west side of the street would then be demolished in the late 1950s.
Yeah.
And in the 1970s, the city passed its very first special scenic district.
Oh, here at the Brooklyn Promenade.
Right, protecting the area west of the promenade from building up and blocking the view of that beautiful promenade.
Well, this district would now be enjoyed by a new type of resident moving into Brooklyn Heights here. Now, starting in the late 1940s, but ramping up with real visibility in the late 1950s, were who we call today the Brownstoners. These are urban professionals of some means who began looking at abandoned houses throughout the region, largely in these brownstone neighborhoods, these elegant homes that have been chopped up into boarding houses, and thought, well, why am I living in a cramped apartment building in Manhattan? I could own a house. For the price of rent a year, you could actually buy a Brooklyn brownstone. This is especially appealing for those who work in downtown Manhattan.
Right.
It's really easy to get there now.
And in our Park Slope episode a couple years ago, we talked about this phenomenon happening, by the 1960s?
In the 60s in Park Slope, right. Here in Brooklyn Heights, it happens a little earlier. This is a very specific group. It's a largely white and white-collar phenomenon here, variously seen as like either the back to the city movement is how they described it. Today, we would see this as gentrification in many cases.
And we're seeing a pattern that I guess would become kind of familiar, right? The artists moving into a distressed neighborhood.
Oh, yeah.
And then people with some means coming in and populating that same neighborhood.
This is not a new story and will play out again and again in many neighborhoods and in many Brooklyn neighborhoods in particular.
Still today.
Yeah. But this new blood would help in holding on to the neighborhood's historic integrity, as it would drive a new surge to protect the area. After all, these are people moving here because they like these buildings for their vintage aspect.
And this is happening at a critical moment for architecture in New York City. I mean, by the early 1960s, the city is seeing the demolition of beautiful, masterpieces like Penn Station in 1963.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and so following Penn's demolition, the Landmarks Preservation Law was signed in 1965, followed by the formation of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, who would, of course, determine which buildings would be saved from the wrecking ball.
That would seem rather complicated and kind of hard, especially in a neighborhood like Brooklyn Heights.
Oh, yeah.
So many historic buildings. How would you even decide what to protect?
Well, fortunately, they have a guidepost of how to possibly handle this. And that would be guidelines from the Federal Department of Interior, who would list Brooklyn Heights as a National Historic Landmark. Brooklyn Heights, the whole place. Later in 1966, that designation would be overseen by the National Register of Historic Places, which is what we have today.
So the federal government was the first to classify Brooklyn Heights as a historic district.
As a historic district, right. And by the way, the Brooklyn Heights Association had been at the forefront, both of getting that designation, of course, but even of getting the landmark law passed. Like, they wanted to make sure that any landmark protection would help their own neighborhood, would come back and help protect Brooklyn Heights. Now, the greatest advocate in Brooklyn Heights for landmark protection was a man named Otis Pratt Pearsall and his wife, Nancy Pearsall. Now, Pearsall had great success in the late 1950s, challenging Robert Moses. He had that under his belt, some plans that Moses had for a housing development along Codman Plaza. This success catapulted into an idea for just historic preservation generally on a district level.
As opposed to building by building.
Right, right. Now, this was influenced by Boston, actually, by a historic designation that the city put on Beacon Hill.
Oh, a lovely neighborhood.
Yes. It was Pearsall who hired Clay Lancaster. So this book, Old Brooklyn Heights, which we've been referencing, he hired Lancaster to write this book in 1961 to document in exacting detail the historical qualities of all of these buildings. And they were also assisted, by the way, this effort was assisted in large part by the Municipal Arts Society, who were basically the driving force behind preservation up to this point in New York City history.
And in Lancaster's book, it's interesting because he gives a history of Old Brooklyn Heights. Then it becomes like a catalog of all of these amazing townhouses, of all of these amazing homes, and he goes street by street giving their history too. But he's really underscoring, how all of these notable architectural styles that we've talked about are all present from the early 1820s
Yeah.
up through, later 19th century. They're all present and preserved in this neighborhood.
Now,
that is notable.
Yes. Thanks to their efforts, there's a real groundswell of support here now in the neighborhood. I greatly enjoyed reading about the build-up here, the intense, almost fabulous groundswell of support, like soirees, rallies at the Hotel Bossert. There was even a gala at the St. George in support of this cause.
We would have been so there.
Oh, yes. The landmarks.
Had we been invited.
Well, finally, the Landmarks Preservation Commission met in the fall of 1965 for the first time and designated their very first landmark, which was Astor Library, home of the Public Theater and Joe's Pub.
Congratulations, public.
Yes, but the chairman also unveiled a proposed Brooklyn Heights Historic District on November 1st of 1965, which was greeted with great enthusiasm. From the New York Times, quote, a resident to the commission yesterday said, living in a 19th century community like Brooklyn Heights is preferable to anything the 20th century has to offer.
Sometimes I feel that way about producing this podcast.
That's true, yeah.
But was everybody who lived in Brooklyn Heights happy about this accomplishment?
Well, there was one group that was really thriving at this point that was not necessarily on board. And that was, when you're checking back in again here with the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society now. They'd started moving in at the start of the neighborhood, and here by the 1960s had purchased several buildings, including their headquarters at 124 Columbia Heights. Okay, so they had other concerns. They had spiritual concerns for growth.
Less interested in landmarking.
That just wasn't really on the top of their list of things necessarily.
And they were firmly planted here, from like headquarters, production facilities, housing.
Yes. And there would be great unease, actually, for many years between the Brooklyn Heights Association and the Watchtower. But regardless of their protests, on November 23rd, 1965, the city designated Brooklyn Heights the first ever historic district. I will add, however, that the Watchtower got a fancy new building in 1969. They purchased the Squibb Pharmaceutical Complex on Columbia Heights.
Which is actually kind of on the other side of the BQE, right?
Yeah.
The northern extension of Columbia Heights.
Near the dog park over there, essentially. It is known to all New Yorkers, at least for during a period of time, for its red Watchtower neon sign that they put on top of it, which was only recently taken down.
And why was that?
Well, because the Jehovah's Witnesses packed their bags and moved out of the neighborhood in 2018, moving out of the old Squibb building and out of most all of their Brooklyn Heights properties.
Where did they go?
They moved it to Warwick, actually, upstate.
And their old properties, they sold them at a nice profit?
They made a nice profit, and also many of them are now being turned into luxury condos. Movie stars are moving in. Now, speaking of actors, remember I talked about the old Holy Trinity Church in Montague?
The tallest spire in Brooklyn, a beautiful Gothic revival style church, right there by that Chase Bank.
Yeah, Lefevre.
Mm-hmm.
Menard
Lefevre, yes.
Well, that tower, that 275-foot tower, okay, like the largest tower in Brooklyn, the one that could be seen by sailors as far off in New York Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they actually had to dismantle it in 1906 because it was falling apart and masonry was falling off of it. Then flash forward, by the 1960s, the congregation of Holy Trinity Church had dissolved, and this was essentially an abandoned church building.
So just imagine that sitting here for a decade. Well, the congregation of St. Anne's, which was another Episcopal church in the neighborhood, well, they moved in 1969. They did a beautiful restoration, and it was here that the arts program, Arts at St. Anne, began in the 1980s. Now, this evolved from classical music programs to some rather avant-garde and theatrical experiences, and some of the most interesting musical performances in the city.
Happening here
in this
at
church,
the newly named St. Anne's and the Holy Trinity.
Yes.
It's nice that they took the name
and just put them together, yes.
Yeah, as a nice homage. So Arts at St. Anne's is producing avant-garde theater and music here.
Right, until 2001, when they moved to an old spice factory in Dumbo and renamed themselves St. Anne's Warehouse. And in 2015, they moved to a new stage in an old tobacco warehouse there in Dumbo.
I hope they aired it out a little before, before they moved in.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, it's all fancy down there because St. Anne's, the warehouse is sitting in Empire Fulton Ferry Park, which now has a beautiful new neighbor, Brooklyn Bridge Park, which has entirely transformed the Brooklyn waterfront, including those old warehouse buildings that were torn down. It's turned this whole waterfront into a spacious new park, which opened in sections starting in 2010.
Which brings us all the way up to today.
Mm-hmm.
And we've made it through plenty of controversies.
But the ghost of Robert Moses, Tom, still haunts us. And let us turn our attention one more time to the area of the BQE under the promenade. In fact, you should really think of the promenade as the lid to this stretch of the BQE. Wouldn't you say that's one way to describe it? Unfortunately, that means that any improvements that you make to the highway below are going to detriment the promenade above, obviously.
And that cantilevered structure that was used and so innovative 70 years ago was never designed to withstand the amount of traffic and the weight of those trucks that are going by it, that are using it today.
The BQE needs work. It's a total mess. So there are several alternative proposals on the table, including one circulated by the Brooklyn Heights Association that would involve building a temporary highway just west of the current location. So it would abut a little bit Brooklyn Bridge Park, just the very back of it. But that would allow work to proceed underneath the promenade without that disturbance.
But it sounds like whatever happens, it's going to affect the promenade, and people are going to be inconvenienced and probably not very pleased about it.
And, some people are suggesting something else that's even, a little bit more insane. What if we just did away with the BQE entirely?
Or it could be dug. Look at what they did with the big dig in Boston.
Well, that's another kind of radical idea, which sounds really good to me.
We would like to thank our supporters on Patreon. Thank you for joining us at patreon.com/BoweryBoys. We say it on every show, but it's true that your support is the foundation that this show is built upon. It's the foundation that allows the two of us to devote all of our time to making the Bowery Boys, researching these topics, and producing the show. So thank you so much to the more than 800 people who have joined us at patreon.com/Bowery Boys. Thank you so much, patrons. And Greg, thank your voice for putting up with this. You made it.
I can't believe it's still with me. Well, I hope to be back in a full-throated vocal fullness in the next episode.
Have a great New York week, whether you live here or not.
See you real soon.